for joining. I'll get us started by giving you an overview on the Climate Bonds Initiative and then move on to some of our processes. So Climate Bonds Initiative is an investor-focused nonprofit that aims to mobilize the debt capital markets for climate solutions. We have three main areas of work, the first being our policy and market engagement work, whereby we advise and guide governments on sustainable finance, particularly assisting emerging markets to grow green bond markets. We support innovations within the green bond market, including securitization, covered bonds, and Islamic finance. Another area of our work is focused on the collection and analysis of market data. We have a green bonds database that feeds into key indices, including S&P and AGI. And using this, we produce an annual State of the Market report, which provides in-depth analysis of climate-aligned and labeled green bond market. The report quantifies all bonds where proceeds are being used to finance low carbon and climate-resilient infrastructure. And then our market work also focuses on producing regional reports and reports focused on specific sectors. And these are periodically published by our team at CBI. And then finally, we have our Climate Bond Standards team and work stream, and this is where I also work in Sergiu. The standards and certifications work is aimed at providing credibility to the green bond market by providing standardized definitions and assurance mechanisms that can give investors the confidence on the credentials of the bonds that are labeled green. So the green bond market first kicked off really early in 2007 with a AAA rated issuance from the European Investment Bank and World Bank. But the wider bond market really started to react to this first issuance, and so it sold within an hour of issue by IFC in March 2013. So this momentum has continued quite strongly, and the green bond market has seen a strong growth, with the market really taking off. In 2014, $37 billion were issued, which was over 3 times the issuance in 2013. And by 2017, issuance was almost $157 billion, with over 1,500 green bond issuances across 37 countries. Projections for 2018 are estimating issuance up to 250 to 300 billion USD. So apart from the promising growth in terms of quantity in the market as a whole, we're also seeing diversification in the types of issuers. There's been an increase in issuance from sovereign and sub-sovereign entities. France recently broke the record with a 9.7 billion euro deal, and Nigeria became the first African nation to issue a sovereign green bond. And emerging markets are also showing great signs of growth, with China and India leading the market. So this chart here is really showing that growth, that momentum, and that diversity. So the Climate Bonds and Standards and Certification Scheme is intended to provide, as I said, credibility to this market. And the use of funds included within these bonds are intended to address climate change. Trust in this green label and transparency to the underlying assets are essential for this market to reach scale, but the investor capacity to assess the credentials is very limited. And so with this in mind and with this objective, CBI created the Climate Bond Standard and Certification Scheme to provide this trust and assurance. It's a labeling scheme for investors and issuers to assist them in prioritizing their investments and really kind of signposting where they address climate change, both from a resilience and a mitigation point of view. It's made up of 2 parts. So the first part is an overarching standard, which is the Climate Bond Standard version 2.1, and that really details the overarching requirements of the standard related to management and reporting processes. Then underneath that overarching standard are sector criteria. And the sector criteria detail the requirements that assets must meet to be eligible within various sectors. And I'll give you a little overview of that in the next few slides of the sectors that we do cover. So an important thing to note is that the criteria that we develop are developed through a consultative process where an analysis is done to ensure that the criteria are supporting a rapid transition to a 2-degree Celsius pathway. So the criteria are aimed to align with the Paris Agreement goals, and they're rooted in emission trajectories that are consistent with rapid decarbonization and also address adaptation and resilience. So getting a bond certified is a simple process. There's several steps to the process, however. So the process begins with preparation of the bond, where an issuer would identify the assets in their portfolio that meet relevant sector criteria. And then they compile all of this information into a green bond framework. And the green bond framework sets out how the use of proceeds of the bond will be used. The next step is to engage a verifier. So the Climate Bonds Initiative has a list of approved verifiers that can be found on our website, and these verifiers must be engaged by the issuer to provide pre- and post-issuance certification. The issuer will provide the verifier with relevant information, and then the verifier, who is familiar with the Climate Bond Standard, will ensure that the requirements have been met. Then the third step in this process is that the verifier submits the report to Climate Bonds Initiative. Climate Bonds Initiative then will receive a decision or will produce a decision on whether the requirements have been met, and the issuer is then free to issue the bond with a certified climate bond mark. And then this is continuously sort of monitored through a certification post-issuance. So within 12 months of issuance, the verifier has to submit a post-issuance report that assures that the use of proceeds were actually assigned and allocated as indicated pre-issuance. And then every year annually for the term of the bond, this reporting is required to, basically it's a simple report that ensures that, again, that the use of proceeds are the same and continue to be aligned with the criteria. So this slide is showing where we have sector criteria within our standard. So the first column are sectors where we already have criteria. This includes wind, solar, geothermal, and marine under energy. Then we have transport, water, and buildings. And so these have been available for some time. Then we have criteria that are in development. Some of them are very close to being available for certification, whereas others are still in, in the middle or early stages. So this includes hydropower, bioenergy, waste management, forestry, and agriculture and fisheries. And also includes grids. And then we have a few that we are planning that are in the pipeline and are in the early stages, and that includes shipping, ICT, and then some industry criteria. So I'm just going to really quickly now discuss the process for developing sector criteria. But before I do that, I'd like to also give IDB an opportunity to discuss their role and support to this process. Enrique?
Enrique, if you can unmute yourself, then we might be able to hear you. Hello? Yes, we can hear you. Hello?
Yes.
Hi, Enrique. Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay. So just a brief introduction that we do in what we do in the IDB related to green bonds, but not only green bonds, but social bonds or sustainable bonds or SDG aligned bonds. What we are trying to do is to support financial institutions, mainly national development banks or public banks, to issue this type of bonds. So we work, as you see in this slide, normally we work from the second point there on portfolio identification. We help them to identify portfolio that is qualifying for issuing bonds, and then we help with the structure of the bonds, with the costs of second second provider on opinion, and the roadshow and the issuance of the bond. In this case, when we started to work with one of the development banks in Mexico, which is FIRA, we saw an opportunity to develop a methodology to evaluate greenhouses and protected agriculture, which is a big portion of their portfolio in Mexico. So we started to develop with Lawrence Pratt, who will speak in a minute, this methodology that will be evaluated and put in place hopefully with the climate bonds initiative. So that's somehow what we do to support this issuance of green bonds. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique. I'll pass on to Jonna to carry on with the development process.
Great, thanks. So just really, yeah, as I said, I'd like to just discuss what the process has been for developing criteria for Mexican protected agriculture. So there's been various stages to this process, beginning with the preparation stage where background research was undertaken, and this was much of this research was undertaken by IADB and their consultants, and then using that initial research, a paper was drafted, the background paper, which was drafted in partnership between CBI and IADB. And then the next step after that was a technical review. So this technical review was to get feedback on the approach and the criteria to see whether they are feasible and practical for issuers and verifiers, and also to assess whether they are aligned with our climate goals. And so the technical review process, I'll talk to you a little bit more about who was involved in that in the next slide. But after this process is the public consultation, which we are launching today through this webinar. And we will be, the period of public consultation will allow for general comments from various stakeholders, and we will use those to finalize and refine the criteria as needed. And then finally, the last step in this process is board approval. We will take the final documents that include feedback from the technical review as well as the public consultation and present that to the Climate Bonds Initiative Board, which is an independent sort of body, and they will approve the standards, and then they will be released to the market. And once they are in the market, they will be available for certification. So here are some of the members of the group that were involved in reviewing the document from a technical perspective particularly. So here, as you can see, this includes Dr. Christine Negra from Versat Vision LLC, Lawrence Pratt, which is an independent consultant with IDB, Juan Manuel Ortega, also an independent consultant, and then we had Peter Chege from Hydroponics Kenya, as well as Rama Chandra Reddy from World Bank Group. So these are who have reviewed thus far, but we continue to have this document peer reviewed by others and look forward to additional comments during the public consultation process. Yeah.
Thank you, Joa. So I hope that provided an overview of our organization and the work we've done under the protected agriculture. Now I would like to pass on to Lawrence, who will talk you through the research rationale and how aligned is this criteria with our climate ambitions. Lawrence, I'll pass you the ball so you be able to move slides at your discretion.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm looking for the control on the slides. I've not used this software. I apologize.
So we can do it.
If it's easier, we can do it.
Just, yeah.
Yeah, please. Okay. So thank you, everyone. I'd like to specifically thank the CBI team, the Inter-American Development Bank team, and FIRA Mexico team for their support on this. It's been an interesting process, and I'm just going to quickly go through the analytical logic of how we got to some of the more critical supporting data for this process. We're looking specifically at Mexico. Mexico is very directly engaged in climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. They have rather significant vulnerability issues, particularly from water. Most of the country suffers from severe to extreme water scarcity with a very large population. There is a highest level government commitment to more climate-friendly and resilient agriculture. This includes their various different filings of national mitigation plans historically, and in national development plans that very closely integrate with their sustainable agriculture strategy as an approach to managing water, reducing poverty, et cetera. So we find protected agriculture, which generally refers to agriculture other than open field, where you're controlling different variables of production. I'll explain in a moment. This is integrated in the Mexican national government strategy in its approach, particularly to reducing vulnerability, but also to increasing the economic returns from agriculture and increase food security through greater agricultural output. Next slide, please. Talk a little bit about the research. We chose tomato as the indicator crop because it is the most important greenhouse crop pretty much worldwide, extremely so in the case of Mexico. It's also where there's the greatest amount of agronomic research to understand the production systems and also comparative data across different climates and across different geographies. There is a fairly decent literature base, peer-reviewed literature base on tomato and different aspects of it, particularly the production aspects, and increasingly more studies also on aspects of producing under protected agriculture systems. So the research approach was to take business as usual, which is a traditional open field seasonal tomato production. So this is the way that we have produced tomatoes generally around the world during the past, certainly the past 30 to 40 years. So this is the most common practice worldwide. It's the most common practice in Mexico, and it is the practice that is being substituted by protected agriculture strategies and technologies. So for purposes of this study, we did the comparisons against 4 different basic protected agriculture, ranging from low-tech, which is basic coverage of the, well, this is a picture right now that you're seeing of traditional open field agriculture, up to an extreme that you're now seeing of extremely high-tech agriculture. Well, you notice that the plants themselves are being grown more in a factory style. They're actually completely isolated from the soil. There's a covering on the soil. The plants are grown in substrates, and you can see that the entire enclosure is heavily protected. You can even see how the workers are protecting hairnets, and also it looks more like a factory production. On the next slide, this is another view of high-tech protected agriculture. So you can see it's rather mechanized. It's very scientific. You can notice the plastic tubing there at the bottom left, for example, that is in the systems that bring fertilizer and moisture, the correct amount of fertilizer and moisture to the maturing crops as they're growing. Next slide, please. And then we have sort of, this one is in the lower to medium tech end, where you see very, very controlled, very intensive production, but you can notice that the system is actually open to the elements. You can also see in here that there's irrigation, drip irrigation, or in this case, microaspersion irrigation. So we have here is a strong intensification of the productivity. So for every unit of land, we are getting much higher productivity, which becomes the key issue to discuss. So we looked more broadly in this study at the request of IDB and our partners in FIDA, while CBI is focused heavily on the climate change, the greenhouse gas footprint and vulnerability. It's of extreme importance to the government of Mexico to consider this more broadly for other national development goals, particularly water, but also to make sure that there's not externalities here as we make this type of a change. So we examined the technology, these different technologies across a wide range of parameters, and trying to land for the purposes of this document in on the greenhouse gas footprint and the vulnerability issues as the primary outputs. And to make the analysis, we translated everything into impact of per kilogram of finished product. If you can go back for 1 second, you're jumping slightly ahead. This is important because what we're really after from a point of view, the unit of analysis is the final tomato or cucumber or green pepper or eggplant or the strawberry that are covered here. So we're able to translate those all into percentage comparisons. So what does protected agriculture look like as a percentage of the business as usual? Continue, please. Next slide. Thank you. Okay. So the factor that's driving significant improvements in water use, vulnerability, climate change, chemical use, fertilizer, pretty much every single factor is the extreme increase in productivity. If we look at business as usual in the open field, the productivity gains are really quite impressive. So for each hectare of land under high tech, there is a 12-fold to 35-fold, using current leading edge practices, improvement in how much productivity can be taken off 1 hectare of land. And that productivity translates into greater use, better land use, at least tighter land use. Also, you're using similar amounts of water or less, similar amounts of fertilizer is less, similar amounts of chemicals less for each unit of tomato. So even the lowest tech solutions show significant productivity improvements, but the 2 most common technologies used in Mexico, advancing in Mexico, the high tech and the shade house, show rather significant improvements, particularly when production is made year-round, which is an additional increase in productivity. So a lot of the underlying drivers for the climate change improvement variables relate to this amazing increase in productivity from this agronomic system that allows the costs of the greenhouse gas footprint, for example, to be diluted across the production. Next slide, please. When we look at water consumption, which ties in to vulnerability to a great extent, and also Mexican national priorities, we see the same evidence of this productivity. A ton of tomatoes under a high-tech system uses 80% less water than a business as usual. And a lot of the business as usual, a great part of the business as usual, is water that's drawn from underground tanks, from underground wells, which in most of Mexico either directly or indirectly draw against human consumption needs. We're talking significant desert climate. And the shade house and medium tech also provide rather substantial improvements in water efficiency. So this is the utmost importance to the Mexican government. Next slide, please. Okay. One of the strongest arguments of protected agriculture is the reduction in vulnerability. We had access to a very detailed Mexican government, the Ministry of Agriculture's database. And historically, looking back about 15 years or 20 years, we see that if you're producing business as usual in the crops of interest that we're looking at, tomato, cucumber, green pepper, eggplant, strawberries, the average loss due to weather or disease, and disease in this case is largely weather-driven, is nearly 4.5%. So this is 4.5% catastrophic loss of the entire harvest. And when you move into the medium tech to high tech systems, because they are physically enclosed, they provide physical protection to the crops and to the soil, we see a dramatic decrease in there, 20 times vulnerability reduction, where we've dropped to only 0.2% catastrophic loss across the same time period. Next slide, please. And then when we look at the greenhouse gas footprints, we did different scenarios to understand the comparatives. Again, everything is normalized to quantity of tomatoes. And the issue with protected agriculture compared to business as usual is that it has infrastructure. You have to build out a greenhouse, which takes some concrete, it takes metal, it takes plastics, it takes rubber, all of which have greenhouse gas implications in the embedded emissions. And the other addition to the production system is some type of covering, whether it be glass or plastic. In this case, we focused on plastic because plastic is a recurring item every 4 to 5 years, depending on the technology. That plastic has to be replaced. And we also broke it down just on pure cultivation variables. So what would be ignoring the infrastructure, considering the infrastructure is embedded, considering the plastic is embedded, then we have the far right column, which gives us a comparison versus open field. So we can see that looking at just the cultivation, the high-tech systems have a dramatic reduction on greenhouse gas open field. And shade houses, when they're used year-round, the second from the bottom column, also have 30%. And really the only place where we don't have very strong reductions in greenhouse gas is when we're using shade houses just partly during the year. So as you can see, that the productivity is so great that even the fully loaded, all the embedded emissions plus the ongoing emissions still show significant improvements in the higher tech and medium tech. And when we include only the plastics, then we also have a fairly significant reduction. So just on the pure greenhouse gas footprint, in spite of the fact that we're adding additional infrastructure, we're still seeing significantly lower greenhouse gas footprints and extraordinary improvements in reduction of vulnerability and water consumption. Next slide, please. This is where I pass back to you, Sergio.
Yes, thank you very much, Lawrence. That was very interesting and obvious benefits to both mitigation and adaptation. I will pass now on to Ujala, who will take up the resulting criteria.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lawrence. Yeah, that's really great to get that sort of understanding of the research. And so the research, using the research, we have developed the protected agriculture criteria. So the criteria are developed in a way to make it simple, to be able to communicate in a simple way to issuers what is required. So really taking that research and converting it into easy to understand criteria that are also easy to report and demonstrate against. So the scope of the criteria include PVC film or glass greenhouses, shade houses, and any supporting infrastructure to these technologies that are supporting that, for technologies that are eligible. So supporting infrastructure could include systems for closure and isolation, precision fertilizer or other chemical application. It can include non-soil substrates, air and light control systems, precision plant nutrition systems, and insect protection. So all of these are eligible use of proceeds within a bond and can be included in the green bond framework, as long as they meet the criteria, which I will now discuss. So these are the criteria that an issuer would need to demonstrate compliance with. So the first one is really the main one, which is that assets must comply with the mitigation criteria in that the scale must be greater than 1 hectare with fully integral, non-permeable air envelope and production in non-soil substrates. And then if not that, then the other sort of criteria would be for a scale that must be greater than 10 hectares of shade house which has a permeable air envelope production. So these sort of cutoffs of the 1 hectare was selected as it was the research and analysis showed that the management capacity at the company would be sufficient to ensure that the selected infrastructure would lead to the desired outcomes. So the desired outcomes being those calculations and that Lawrence presented in the research. So that's the thinking behind that. And then the other criteria that also must be demonstrated or met to be eligible is that heating cannot be used, and only it can be used in cases where it is defense against cold in winter months. So it cannot be, year-round or for other purposes. Only uses passive cooling. Active ventilation is permitted only for managing heat and relative humidity. So yes, so because the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that would be very high, so we have put this criteria there. And then the next criteria is regarding irrigation and water. So where irrigation is used, drip or microaspersion systems are only allowed, and monitoring must be undertaken with those systems as well to be eligible. And then the issuer must demonstrate a commitment to reuse or recycle used plastic sheeting and tubing with a demonstrable policy or plan. So that would be submitted to the verifier with information on how the plastic would be reused or recycled. And then finally, no use of red band agricultural chemical products would be allowed, and use of non-EPA and FDA registered products for export market. So these are also ineligible if these are used in the process. So the adaptation resilience requirements, so after a review of the research and analysis of the findings, as Lawrence presented, the reduction in vulnerability is quite dramatic between open field agriculture and protected agriculture. And so from an adaptation resilience perspective, protected agriculture is a very positive sort of technology and strategy. So assets would automatically pass under the climate resilience criteria. So there's no requirement on reporting under this component of our criteria. However, we do recommend that best practice is followed. So some key best practice strategies include having field operations with soil cover and integral air envelopes. It's produced in substrates and use water recovery and reuse systems. And then we have a few things that are excluded from the scope and would not be covered by these criteria or eligible under these criteria. So the production of pesticides and fertilizers, though some issuers may be involved in this would not be an eligible investment or asset and could not be included in the use of proceeds of the bond. They're out of scope due to their high energy and chemical intensive nature. And there's no criteria to ensure that the production process is low carbon or climate resilient. Installation vehicles would also be excluded, so an investment could not support this. If an issuer is interested in financing assets related to installation of greenhouse of protected agriculture, they would need to reference the low carbon transport criteria for details and meet what the eligibility criteria therein are. And this is simply because this can impact the greenhouse gas emission profile of the crops. They have not been considered in the criteria, and it can really raise the emissions profile. And then finally, irrigation and other water-related infrastructure. Again, these are welcome additions to any bond issuance, but they would be covered under a different criteria where the requirements are set out. So they would be covered under our water criteria. And so that would include drip and micro aspersion irrigation. And then all water infrastructure do remain certifiable under the water criteria. So we recommend any issuers interested in that to reference these documents that are available on our website for water. So the reporting requirements for meeting these criteria and becoming eligible and receiving certification are outlined here. So the issuer must provide to the approved verifier the information necessary to demonstrate compliance with all the applicable requirements. So the ones that I just outlined, the issuer has to provide all of that to the verifier. And there's 3 stages of reporting. There's pre-issuance reporting, post-issuance reporting, and annual reporting thereafter. And as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, the annual reporting is really to ensure that the original use of proceeds remain the same and they remain aligned with the criteria. And so basically this ensures that all the requirements they're all maintained and in compliance for the duration of the term of the bond. So that brings me to the end of an overview of the criteria. So Sergio, would you like to take it forward?
Yes, thanks to Jala and Enrique and Lawrence for walking us through the protected agriculture criteria. We're now going to open for a few questions, and I've seen already a few coming in. But just as a reminder, you can submit questions using the Q&A panel at the top right-hand corner of the webinar platform. However, if you're attending this call, you can also let me know, and I'll unmute you, or you can unmute yourself and you can ask the questions. So I think we have a few questions here, spanning some are more technical, some are more general. So I'll start with one, although this was mentioned just recently, but Lawrence, perhaps you might be able to answer this question. What are the water-related requirements for this criteria?
The research shows that the water benefits are achieved when the water is managed through controlled mechanisms. So the primary one is to make sure that all of the water that's used for direct production is drawn, when that is drawn from a source other than rain, is either a hydroponic system that's piped, excuse me, or a drip or microaspersion. So the recommendation that the technical recommendation was basically the the CBI water criteria applied to agriculture. So the practice in these greenhouse and protected agriculture systems is to use those controlled methods rather than large-scale water. And it's the technology itself of the protection and the agronomic techniques that allows those techniques to be used and actually makes them the preferred technique to better control water flows. So it's when other than rain-fed, the technology calls for using drip, hydroponic, piped, or microaspersion.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Lawrence. We have another question, which is quite central. So what was the minimum scale for eligible projects set 1 hectares for shade houses and 1 hectare for non-permeable envelopes? Lawrence, you think you can also answer this question?
I will answer it. This is the only subjective point in the analysis. The issue, the logic for CBI and this type of climate bond issuance is that we want to focus on the infrastructure. So we want to be able to look at the actual physical investment and decide whether or not that is conforming to the standard or the expectations of the standard. The issue with greenhouses is that the greenhouse gas impact and some of the other impacts, but let's say primarily the greenhouse gas impact, is the actual number as opposed to the theoretical number depends very much on how the infrastructure is used and how the infrastructure is managed and maintained. So we consulted different experts in Mexico in particular, through our colleagues at FIDA and through others, and asked what is the scale at which there is great certainty that the investment is continuing and is continuing under the conditions that lead to these benefits, particularly the greenhouse gas benefits. And the proposal, which is an interesting point, we believe, for discussion and comment, was when you have companies investing in 1 hectare of high tech, that is a company that has the management capacity to ensure that all the other operational parameters are in place. So that creates extremely high reliability or assurance that the proposed benefits or the anticipated benefits will be realized. And that similar number for shade house operations was considered to be about 10 hectares. So I will state that those numbers are extremely conservative. Companies that are operating that size operations are as close to guaranteed as we can get in a natural system to realize those benefits. There are arguments that those numbers could be lower or could be smaller, and that would be an interesting area to receive comments, I believe.
Thank you, Lawrence. There's another question regarding to greenhouse gas emissions. So do issuers need to calculate greenhouse gas emissions?
I think perhaps better if CBI
Yeah, sure.
respond to that one?
Sure. So as the way the criteria are set up, no, greenhouse gas emissions would not be required for calculation because we tend to avoid such assessments like life cycle cost assessments and analysis where possible, where we think that proxies are able to indicate the low carbon aspect of that asset. And so the research that was presented today, you know, this cutoff of the 1 hectare and 10 hectare, as well as the productivity gains with the requirements on water and these other requirements, the criteria are able to identify low carbon assets without having to go through a greenhouse gas emissions accounting. So they are not required under the criteria.
Thanks, Ujala. Since it's CBI's turn, there's another question more suited for a CBI member to answer. So what if a bond has a mixture of assets and projects, including in a portfolio, not only protected agriculture assets? Are they eligible?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, no, it's a good question. And that's, you know, as I mentioned in a couple of slides, we are very flexible in bonds, including multiple types of assets under various sector criteria. So we have sector criteria available for transport, water, and solar power, wind power, as well as others. So issuer is free to include a variety of assets within their portfolio and put those into a bond structure. The only requirement would be that each one of those various criteria are met and reported against. But that is not a very complicated process. The reporting would be in one document. So it would just require the issuer to become familiar with the various criteria and report against them.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Does anyone else want to share any more comments? Feel free to use the Q&A panel. If not, you can also email the questions either to myself at sergiu.jiduc@climatebonds.net or to my colleague Katie. You can see her email address. We have a question in Spanish, which you might struggle. So,
I'm wondering, can the other panelists see the question who are perhaps Spanish speakers? Lawrence or Enrique, can you see the question?
I see it. Reading it. I can respond. Give me
Excellent.
1 second to make sure I understand it.
Sure.
Okay, I will, Angelica Fernando, I will respond. I'll respond in English, and then I can do it in Spanish if you wish. How shall I respond? Let me respond. So the question relates is if the fertilization criteria are used in agriculture, why isn't in-soil production with irrigated fertilizer systems included? The short answer is the criteria focuses on the actual infrastructure. It really is fundamentally about the covering. It's about whether you're under protected cover, because that's where the vulnerability systems are increasing. In those systems, the irrigation with fertilizer is commonly used and widely used, so it is included. It is not one of the underlying criteria because it's associated with the technology, but if it's open field with that system, it's not covered in the recommended criteria because it doesn't have physical protection barrier above. And I'm happy to, people want to, Sergio or Katie, if you want to refer follow-up questions to me, I'm happy to follow up.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. If you want to also answer in Spanish, feel free.
Okay.
There's a follow-up question, Angelica.
Okay. I'll respond to that one. So she's asking, is it possible to consider less than 1 hectare as long as it's fully covered? That one, I think I answered in English, so I will answer it in Spanish, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, Angélica y otros, esto es un tema que queremos recibir comentarios, sobre todo desde el campo. Temas que queremos entender bajo cuáles circunstancias o cuál es el tamaño mínimo donde hay casi certeza que se van a realizar de verdad los beneficios de gases de efecto invernadero y los otros beneficios de reducción de agua. Entiendo que un sistema muy pequeño, extraordinariamente manejado, muy bien manejado, sí va a realizar los beneficios, pero lo que hemos visto es en las operaciones más pequeñas hay mucha más variabilidad y queremos escoger un tamaño donde casi se elimina la posibilidad o reduce mucho la probabilidad que no va a ser una operación seria que sí cumple con todos estos elementos. Pero estamos abiertos, como dije en la presentación en inglés, es un área todavía subjetiva y bienvenida con comentarios, sugerencias. Thank you.
Very much.
I basically repeated the point that was subjective. That is probably the only subjective point, and we're open to all suggestions or recommendations at what that number should be to guarantee that that level or higher will be a very, very high probability of conformance.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think it's time to wrap up this webinar. Many thanks for everyone for attending, especially to Lawrence and Enrique from IIDB for providing all of useful inputs into the development of this protected agriculture criteria. The public consultation will close on October the 3rd. Until that date, we still have time to submit your questions to either Katie or myself. Any thoughts, feedback, and we'll be able to revise the criteria if necessary. We'll be posting a recording of this webinar online, and we'll email everyone the link so you can visualize it in your own time. If you know anyone that would be interested but could not attend the webinar today, please do share the link. And so I would like to thank you everyone and wish you a wonderful day. Goodbye.